I remember I saw it.
Oh yeah.
Alright guys, sorry for the delay. Welcome to round 5 of something SDO. In overview of DDI Armour, we're talking about positioning in the outside contact solvers. In CG, we have IIUM and CO we have Lisbeth. So we open the case on how you feel topic and now invite the finalists. Yeah, so we'll be timing, you guys can time it up.
Speaker, Donald Trump, hypocritical, he can be a bit crazy, but that's our opinion. What we're telling you in this debate is that there are other people out there who want to hear the full story. Not only like the really bad side of him, and it's not really done in the status quo, but also the good side of him. This he has done to other people in the past. And we think that more important, that your job as a conservative editor of a prominent right-wing newspaper is to forward your interests and to forward your stances in this debate and to add to the existing discourse that we think is currently unbalanced within the status quo. You can have your opinions with the speaker, but there are voters on the margins who want access to the full story before they go into the dark side of Donald Trump. Our goal in this debate is flexible between two. One, we're going to write more stories of Donald Trump. We need things like, for example, feature stories, special coverage, and things like that. We already do this for front runners in the status quo anyway, and we need to point Donald Trump as 41% of American votes. He is a front runner, and he has to proceed that in this debate. Second of all, we're going to get experts down to talk about him, right? Talk about how his secret policies are. Thank you. Talk about his business policies and stuff like that. We need to do this for front runners. Anyway, third of all, we are very happy to send reporters on campaign trials so that we get the full coverage of whatever we want to talk about and all of those things. I'm going to talk about two things in this speech. First of all, what are the interests of a prominent right-wing newspaper? Why is it have positive coverage? Second of all, what extended coverage does for existing for discourse in a moment in American society today. First of all, what are the interests of a prominent right-wing newspaper? We think there are two interests. One is profit motive, and second of all is to support Republicans. So that, yes, that's it.
Yeah, what about the other president Republican presidential candidates who have received incredibly little limelight given Trump's nonsense?
I will talk about that a bit later if we talk about this, right? Let's talk first about profit motive, right? We get this is important in this debate because your job as a prominent right-wing newspaper is to stay afloat and actually make money. We get the way to go about doing so is to create news stories that are interesting for these people. We recognize in this debate that the Republican debates are a hell of a lot more exciting and a hell of a lot more interesting compared to your Democrat debates, right? So the reason why this goes because of people like Donald Trump, because Donald Trump is also a controversial statement that catches people's attention. The thing is that it's important for these newspapers to catch on this limelight and to tag along with Donald Trump so they're able to make money for themselves in the future and stay afloat in this debate. But more important, right? In doing so, we draw viewership for these people, we should think is how exactly they make money. But second of all, right? We recognize in this debate that political ability in the US right now is incredibly high. The reason why this is so is because people don't tend to want to buy the politics because they don't think it affects them, they don't think it's important for them. And if when we get Donald Trump more coverage, we get people who not only just look at his good side as his meeting of but we're going to examine the entire picture of Donald Trump. So you're able to make a balanced, informed decision as to whether or not they should vote for Donald Trump in the future. So thank you. But more importantly, right, within the second because thank you, that people don't have politics interesting. They find it boring that it's not part of their lives. Then we bring Donald Trump into the picture, we think we make it interesting for them. Because they see, for example, the top controversial statements that Donald Trump is saying, and why that is possibly good for America in the future. So thank you. They say that we're able to opt into the system and opt into politics in the first place. But second of all, right, about Republicans. We think that first of all, Republicans are not that bad, right? There are people like Ronald Reagan, for example, who bought America out of some of that setting and ended the Cold War. We think that Donald Trump could possibly do those things too. It's a fallacious argument to say Donald Trump can't do any of those things. We think it's important to note that in this debate. Because the problem here is that Donald Trump may not have the opportunity to do so, and if only he is not elected as a presidential candidate, or even as a candidate for the Republican Party to start. We think it's important therefore that for him to get a positive coverage that we think is important. But here's what I'm going to do with this analysis, right? On what are these other candidates? Now, first of all, we get the other candidates are pretty that good. You have things like, for example, how the Kali movement and Cruz leaking secret, sensitive, confidential information on the prior presidential debates, like literally last weekend. We We need these are the people who are very willing to sacrifice their own national security to get for their votes. We get Donald Trump is a bit different. Because even like the racist statements that they were banning Muslims out of the country, he's doing for the interest of his state. Because he genuinely believes that there's a problem and he wants to shut the problem out of the US. That's a good thing. That's comparatively better than leaking sensitive information to the public to start with. But even if that's the case, and even if Donald Trump is really that awful, who are we to decide that in this debate? We will tell you that it's important for these voters to see the full picture first, then they can make the balanced position. Because in the status quo as of now, there's overwhelmingly negative coverage of Donald Trump to start with. It's important to create the countervailing narrative so that people can access information. So second up, what is negative coverage? You before that, yes.
Do you think Donald Trump is going to win the primaries for the Republican Party? Yes or no?
Yes. 49% votes right now, so you know it's a good thing. Second of all, it's precisely because he's going to win the primaries that he's a front runner. We already do this for front runners anyway. You have to continue and tell me why that's a problem. Second argument, on extensive coverage, right? We recognize in this debate that Trump currently has a shitload of bad reputation because of how the media is framing him and framing his narratives. This is unfair to him because the coverage of media only sees, for example, Clinton as the goddess of light, and you have like Trump as the evil bad guy. It's something for Trump because Trump also is a good guy and there is good in him too. By the coverage, 70%, even 90% of the media will thank you, saying that he's an overactive, he's a really bad guy. He doesn't get a chance to defend himself. So we can, on the first level, we're giving him the chance to defend himself. We're giving him the ability to access the countervailing narrative that doesn't exist in the status quo. But second, right, we say that we see that people want access to this counter narrative because we believe that a vote needs to be made in an informed, balanced decision. And the economy should only have access to bad stories and not good stories. Because your vote as a whole is not informed, it's not balanced. You don't know what you have a vote, you're making like a rational cost-benefit analysis for yourself. We can have people want access to that to make a legitimate vote in this way. But finally, we can have able to create this cost in this way, right? Because at the point we cover Donald Trump, we also cover republicanism, giving people an incentive to look at other Republican candidates too. There's a trickle effect is important in this way. So if you want to candidate are really as good as nothing wanted to be, we can up to the people themselves to decide that for themselves. But I encourage people don't get access to vote, don't get access to this coverage, don't get access to Republican people. They don't have the ability to make that choice for themselves, therefore they can make an informed decision. By the end of this speech, the speaker, we think that Trump right now has a really bad rep, which is like not entirely representative of him. We think that people want to make informed decision and have the ability to make that choice. But in the status quo as of today, they don't have the ability to do so because of the lack of information regarding his flip side. For more than to stand on the outside in this debate.
I thank the participants, not like the Abina.
Mr. Speaker, the only reason why Donald Trump currently has a 45% rating in the polls is because there isn't enough coverage on the rest of the presidential candidate. At the point where right-wing newspapers or newspapers in general across America focus on the Republican race as an issue of Donald Trump versus the rest, there is no ability for the right-wing party to be able to distinguish between the different candidates and what these different candidates necessarily stand for. That's why opening government was incredibly naive when he told us that Donald Trump is currently the best because at least he's saying actual policies. No, he just said Muslims are crap and Muslims ought to be banned from the country. He never said any actual policies about how he's going to solve the immigration problem or any other problem or combat Islamophobia within the US. So it's not true that, right, and comparative. People like Harley Fiorina, people like Ted Cruz, like Marco Rubio, all have incredibly sensible reforms on immigration, none of which are actually covered because everyone, including CNN, Fox News, and every other news channel, just lumps it together as the rest of the Republican candidates against Donald Trump. I'm going to do two things in this speech. Firstly, why is it unstrategic to provide such extensive coverage of Donald Trump? But secondly, why is it that this damages the interests of right-wing newspapers and the right-wing party in general? Before that, some rebuttal to the previous speaker. He said the profit motive is important and we need to get as much people to read our news as possible. Contrary to that, right, Donald Trump being the sort of divisive politicizing force that he is, isn't going to get you more readership. It's only going to alienate the vast majority of people in the Republican Party or in the Republican side who are incredibly disgusted with the sort of fear-mongering statements and extreme statements that he has been making. But second of all, Donald Trump is getting attention because it's controversial. Exactly, he's attention grabbing, but there is little policy making that he's actually doing, and there is no incentive for him to make any form of these concrete policies when the way he has been rising in the polls is purely based on such fear mongering. At a point where you continue to grab on this and you prevent people from being able to analyze the different policies which you think is important. And I'm going to tell you why those are important. You lose all traction and you lose the sort of readership that you want. But more importantly, if you want to talk about political apathy, the reason political apathy, like even if you want to combat political apathy, the way to combat political apathy is to not make a theatrical spectacle out of your political race. Right? So it's actually focus, no thank you, on the actual political issues that are the most important within your Republican race. And that's not what's going to happen. You're going to do on your side when you focus on Donald Trump exclusively. But secondly, we think that your side increases that political apathy. Why? Because at the point that Donald Trump becomes the face of the Republican Party or controls the way and when discourse occurs, where everyone is only in rebuttal to Donald Trump rather than actually producing their own concrete policies. We think that what your side happens is that people just get turned off because there is no actual debate, there is no actual discourse. Lastly, they talk to you about this idea of trickle-down effect. This trickle-down effect, no thank, is precisely the problem that's happening in this debate, right? Because the trickle-down effect means that at best, the rest of your Republican candidates are being marginalized, right? You only get marginal information about what your other candidates are saying, rather than actually focusing on the big policy debates and the big policy discussions that we ought to be having within the Republican debate. So why is it so thankfully that it is as strategic to provide such extensive coverage to Donald Trump? And we are just going to make the obvious, the rather radical claim here that Donald Trump's probably not going to win the Republican primary. And even if he does win the Republican primary, he's probably not going to win the presidential race. Why? Firstly, because it is still very early on in the polls and the primary polls. And empirically, people who have run very high in the early part of the poll have never won a race. Look at Jared Ford, for instance. Look at Jim Carter, for instance, and how they lost the race eventually, even though they were the front runners in the early part of the presidential race. No thank you. But secondly, we think that right wing is not synonymous with Donald Trump, but that's the way it has been presented today, and that's what the Republicans don't want. We think that the Republicans don't want discourse to be controlled by Donald Trump, and that's what and their side only entrenches that position when it provides even more coverage than already happens. No thank you on Donald Trump. But secondly, why is it that we think that this damages the interest of the right-wing newspapers and the right-wing party? 3 reasons. Firstly, we think that the motive of any right-wing or any newspaper in general is to gain as large a viewership as possible because they want to maintain the profits. And the only way they're going to be able to gain that large viewership and sustain that large viewership over the long term is when you maintain some degree of credibility. And how you do that is by maintaining some veneer of objectivity, at least by providing coverage across all the other presidential candidates, rather than focusing on I'll give you a moment, on one particular candidate, which in this case is Donald Trump, particularly when there's already so much coverage on Donald Trump as well. Before that, closing, any points?
Your coverage right now is like literally very negative. What about people who want positive coverage but don't get it on your side of the house?
We don't think like that there needs to be this positive coverage. We're not quite sure who you want to have this positive coverage, given that the people who support Donald Trump already think that he's a god, and I think that all his policies are great. So it's not clear who you're talking about who needs that sort of positive coverage in the first place. But secondly, what happens under the other side of the house? Is that people who are in the right-wing party who want to vote in the Republican primary don't know who to vote for because they don't know anything about the viable policies of the other presidential candidates. They just know that it's Donald Trump and a bunch of other candidates who all pretty much sound the same. There's no ability for these other candidates to distinguish themselves and talk about the different nuances between their different policies. Because Donald Trump always controls that discourse. And we think that is bad because at the end, we want voters to be able to make a good informed choice about who they want to represent them as a Republican candidate in the presidential race. But secondly, we think that it also damages the image of the newspaper because you want to get more shareholders in the long term. But we think that at the point that you alienate so many of the viewers because they don't believe in Donald Trump, and in fact they are repulsed by Donald Trump's position on so many things. Even if you believe that Donald Trump will win, that is secondary to the fact that you are a part of a company and your interest should be first and foremost to the company, and at the point that you alienate so many readers and so many shareholders, you don't get it. But last of all, how do you help the face of the Republican Party? Because currently Donald Trump focuses on one half of the conservative spectrum. We lose all nuance across the rest of that spectrum. We want to gain that spectrum back, and the only way is when we have extensive coverage on the rest of the Republicans. For all these reasons, we're incredibly proud to oppose.
This house is a conservative right-wing newspaper. We provide extensive and positive coverage of Donald Trump's presidential campaign.
Thank you. Right, thank you for the speech. Now,
Thank you.
What I'm about to say might sound terrible to an old man, but I am a conservative right-wing editor. So here's the point. The current context makes Donald Trump a very popular candidate. The question really here today is, do we consider him a real candidate for presidency? And we say, why not? We think that in the current context of a litany of attacks, we've lost the abilities to sit on the fence. We've lost the ability to center on the center and be a moderate. To put an ex-president, you're either fighting for us or you're against us. And that's the feelings on the ground right now as an editor we would feel. What that means is that the extreme to some extent is becoming more popular. And for that reason, there's no reason why we as right-wing people would not want to also help Trump along. I will be furthering that in my analysis of how we actually win elections and the mechanism behind it. But before that, I do have about 3 points of rebuttals in which I'll do some extensions. Now, the first question is this. We've now established Donald Trump as a viable candidate, and we see no reason why we can't support him. But are the other candidates really that good? Now, Mr. Speaker, I assure you that they are not. Ted Cruz wants to fight Obamacare, but happens to be on Obamacare itself. Ben Carson, for instance, tells everyone that he tried to knife someone, but everyone says that he's lying. With all due respect, it is at best a wash on both sides for everyone, because no one is perfect. But that said, that is why they have completely ignored my first speaker's speech, right? On how we also need to give him positive coverage, on how we do have to acknowledge that Donald Trump has business acumen, that for what it's worth, he could fix the American economy, and for what it's worth, that 41% of not Republicans, but of the entire American population, do think that Trump can make America great again. So for what it's worth, we think that Trump actually has a benefit, that at this point, he is the front runner, that we should throw our support behind him instead of undermining the Republicans by defaming one of our own candidates. That's it. Second point of rebuttal, let's talk about the profit motive. Now this is quite weird because the main argument is that people won't read because Trump is divisive and that somehow alienates readers. That's somewhat contradictory, right? Because when someone is divisive, when someone is controversial, all the more you want to find out about the issue. That's why discourse begins whenever we are able to create furore and backlash, or perhaps just discourse about something. No, thank you, sir. For that reason, we say they've contradicted themselves. He is divisive. Hallelujah. We can get people to consider the good points about him, get people to talk about him. No, thank you, sir. And we say, in fact, people want to know the other side. As we research Donald Trump, and that's also in the psyche of a voter, we do want to know what else he has in store, right? We do want to know how he maintains a huge business empire, right? No, thank you, sir. For the reason we think that this satisfies republicanism, as well as our own profit motive, because people will very much want to know about Donald Trump. In fact, we will not alienate readers, but gain more readers by giving them something which arguably no one else has decided to give. As my first speaker said, and I researched this and developed, the whole point is to give a countervailing narrative, to be unconventional and give something new for people to read. There is in no way alienating people, but getting people to read our stuff. Now, on to the third point of rebuttal, sir. Let's talk about whether we are marginalizing the Republican candidates. The whole point is that it's really about attention. Because we have had Donald Trump there, people are more and more watching the Republican debates because they are interesting than Democrat debates. It's just the success of an individual of a group. Even if you say it's more of an individual, we do admit at least they watch our debates instead. And every win we have against the Democrats is a great thing for us, right? But I say even if, fine. And I'll talk about that later in how we win an election. And the third thing is, in fact, we have seen lots of candidates use him as a foil, right? They talk about their policies, in conjunction with Donald Trump. They use him to start that conversation about what we want to do in our policies. So we see that Donald Trump not only brings attention to Republican issues, bringing them into the spotlight, but also serves to bring the spotlight into other candidates who are smart enough to use him as a foil. We see him as a great thing for Republicanism as a whole. Now, before I transit on,
So as this editor, if you were to write an article on why Trump's economic policies are positive and great, how would they title that?
I'm not sure about why the title is relevant to this debate, since it really doesn't make sense, but I guess you could do one of those pop-up titles like Trump making America great again. Let's move on. Okay, moving on to my substantive material, let's actually analyze the mechanism of how we win an election. The point is this: the current context is such that we have way too many candidates. Stephen Colbert on the famous late night show pulled up a picture of all the candidates, asked someone to give him the name of this one, Jim Gilmore, I'm pointing at him now, and he would give 100 USD if they could. They could not. We have too many people with the Republicans split between too many people. Now the thing about the preliminaries is that after the preliminaries, we will have one person who will represent the Republicans as a whole. By throwing our support behind Donald Trump as a whole now and gathering Republican support behind it, we can, at the very least, after preliminaries, have enough support for him to take down the Democrat candidate. So that is where I come back to my point, right? Is it all right we marginalize our presidential candidates? It is perfectly fine because it is strategically viable now for the Republicans. Instead of fielding a huge boatload of people that all have power split between them, they will support one guy who perhaps, and we do think quite positively, can defeat either Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton. So marginalization is perfectly fine. And more than anything, we believe that as of now, in having too many candidates, people are believing that the Republicans cannot make it. So what we need to do is actually, as historical context, build the same narrative that George Washington Bush once had. Let's set some context here. When we look at that Republican candidate and his candidacy to the presidential election, we see that he was one candidate that was able to steamroll over everyone else. He was acknowledged as that one candidate who had full-on Republican support. So what we have to do now is to avoid the divisiveness that strikes us today, but actually follow what we did with Bush and ensure that we have popular support behind one single candidate. So what we have to do now on a macro scale is acknowledge that strategically, for us as Republicans, it satisfies a profit motive to give a countervailing narrative. And as Republicans, it satisfies our agenda as well to actually bring attention to the Republicans as well as support a candidate which we have proven is very viable for presidency. For all those reasons, we are very proud to propose.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister for his speech. Now, my Deputy.
Speaker, this is an active debate and requires us to look at the perspective of the editor. That's why we never stood here and stood against Republican values. All we did was question was whether or not Trump was seriously the best candidate to back up right now. Given that it is still quite a lot of time before we even hit the results of the primary elections, so we want positive coverage for Trump. We thought that was okay. What they needed to defend was why this positive coverage needed to come at the expense of every other candidate who are currently running within the election. And the question is then, why can't we then, if we so seriously want to back Trump and think he's the best possible candidate, then why can't we back him up and run this extensive positive coverage after he's won the primary election? And while he's going up against Clinton, when the battles and the lines drawn between the Republicans and the Democrats become that much clearer. But we think, no thank you, this is still at the beginning stage of the primary, so we still haven't decided who's the best Republican candidate to represent our interests. That's why as much information about the other candidates needs to be there as much as possible. 3 things I'm covering in my speech. Firstly, why is Trump simply unlikely to win the presidential elections, not just the primaries? Secondly, how do we get the best votes and best kind of political culture within the United States? Thirdly, what then best helps the interest of the newspapers, because that's like, yeah, so important because at the debate. So why is Trump unlikely to win? Look, like they keep claiming that we're going to run lots of extensive information about his business policies and things like that. The fact is he has proposed none. Trump is entirely riding on entirely emotional rhetoric with the public right now. So far as they want to claim that he has a 45% vote within the population, the fact is that these kind of initial votes very rarely mean anything, because the calculus you take when some random newspaper reporter picks you up on the street and asks you who are you likely to vote for, the calculus you take as you carry with you into the voter box and actually start to think, this is the guy who's going to represent me for the next 4 years. Things change, Mr. Speaker. We saw that it was maybe a 70 to 30% of Scotland in the initial votes who were voting away to break away from Scotland. By the end, we lost that vote anyway, right? We think things can change in the long run. No thanks. So we also, and then like, let's see how we take that case at its best and accept that maybe all the Republican candidates are a little lackluster, which we don't really think is true, right? We think Carly Fiona has basically run great things about feminism and has like stood for a lot of women within the Republican Party. We think that like Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio have also stood for great things. So then the next question becomes this. Who is the best possible candidate who can win against Hillary Clinton in the actual presidential elections? This is where they missed that point about how Trump was incredibly divisive and controversial. Contrast this with Hillary Clinton, who is likely to represent the Democrats, who's incredibly centrist, and is therefore likely to be able to capture the majority of the centrist, like slightly more left-leaning Republicans who do not like Trump, who don't want to vote for Trump, essentially 55% of you guys who are voting for him in these initial polls right now and are likely to vote for Clinton instead. Under these circumstances, given how divisive and controversial Trump is, we don't think he's likely to beat Hillary Clinton out within the long run, right? You just don't have a lot of Republicans who are that interested to him, about him. And we think therefore, given that second question, how then do we get going back to the first question, we also think that he has the best possible hardcore supporters in status quo. Given that these newspapers are going to be read by Republicans, we're not sure whose minds you're going to be changing under your policy. Second point, how we get the best votes. Because it was really weird when they stood up here for free choice, recognizing that there was, in their world, a huge lack of information about every other candidate who was running within the election. This is where we begin to question, how free is the choice of every other Republican voter out there when they don't know who else is running, they don't know what the policies are, even if you claim they're lackluster, they never make an informed decision for themselves. If Trump is so clearly going to win within the primary elections already, we don't think this policy is then going to hurt him. But given that we don't think he's going to win, and we don't think, given that this is an incredibly conservative, right-wing newspaper, Democrats are going to be the one to be reading this. So the only people who will be affected will be Republicans who possibly don't really like Trump, but aren't quite sure who else and what other possible candidate they could then vote for. This is a policy that best captures them. I'll take a point from Chloe.
Given the fact that a lot of the times people are more interested in reading news about Trump rather than Ted Cruz or Jeb Bush, why do you think that your newspaper would sell more if you talk about other Republican candidates, especially when fence sitters also read this newspaper?
All right, going to the third point now, interest of newspapers and how we increase viewership. Given that there is already extensive amounts of coverage out there on Trump, we don't think you're going to gain any more new viewers just by providing more coverage on him. We think that what exists is that there is an untapped amount of readership potential and capital out there because there's nobody else covering other kinds of candidates. Given that, we think that when you start covering this unique amount of information that no other newspaper is then going to be covering, we think that's when you distinguish yourself from the mass of other Republican newspapers and the mass of other even Democrat newspapers because nobody else is covering these other kinds of viewership. They claim that Trump's great, right? Trump's a great crowd pleaser. He can please, like, he basically can, like, create, like, more, like, he basically captures the attention of lots of people. No thanks. We did this as well. We still had to question. Just because you put in more coverage on him does not necessarily mean he's suddenly going to start out amazing policies that will make people want to vote for him more. Why? Because we haven't noticed so far, every single time we've covered stuff about him, it's because he just said something incredibly controversial within the newspaper without any actual policies to back that controversy, without any actual like change within the country. Given that all well-meaning Republicans who are intelligent, reasonable voters right now don't know what's going to happen to their party, don't know what the future of the Republicans is going to be, need some kind of counter narrative they are completely unwilling to provide. And there's already been and instead all they want to do is hype up the coverage that every single other Republican newspaper is already going to give. We don't think their site gives any kinds of unique benefits under these circumstances. But because we think we'll increase these kinds of viewerships. That's why we think that the editors within the newspaper are going to get more viewership and therefore gain basically more grounds with shareholders, investors, or whatever. Because we think that for these shareholders are only going to look at the numbers and the readership within the newspaper, and that's a benefit you ultimately people achieve on our side, because you give that unique benefit to all other Republican viewers that no other newspaper is going to be able to cover. But we think more than that. What your newspaper is probably going to be trumped even by Democrat newspapers and Democrat coverage. It's possibly the fact that you are the first Republican newspaper to come up with some form of objective, unbiased coverage of the presidential elections, who's actually able to capitalize on the fact that there's no other information given within this black hole in the elections right now. Under these circumstances, we get the viewers, we get the shareholders, we got the better votes and the better understanding of the elections.
I thank the speaker for her speech. Now I will never come. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, whether or not we believe that Donald Trump would actually win the election or not, I think is immaterial. Because if anything, site closing government is going to tell you why, regardless of whether or not you believe he's going to win the election or not, and whether or not you agree with his sentiments or not, it is still important as the editor of that right-wing newspaper that you still make a positive and analytical article reviewing Donald Trump. I'll tell you why this is necessary based on two things. Number one, how we assist in the creation of informed voters, and secondly, I'll answer to you how we help the ways in which the Republicans are perceived. Before that, most of our rebuttals will be integrated, but I'd just like to highlight this. Side opposition questions us and say, are you actually helping the newspaper? Our response is, we do think so. Given the fact that a lot of the times people on the ground who are debaters like you and I, who do our analytical reading about each and every different candidate that exists out there, it is less likely that a person, whether he is a Republican or a fence-sitter or a Democrat, to want to pick up a newspaper that says Ted Cruz or Jeb Bush. You're more likely to feel that there is a bigger chance of more interest in you reading a newspaper when the headline says Trump helps the poor with economic growth. You're probably going to be like, what, really? Or oh, wait, yeah, that's actually really true. And you would pick it up and you would actually read it. It is more likely to sell. You are taking opportunity of an already scandalous event which already requires less work for you to be able to profit from, in comparison to the first mover's advantage, which Natalie wanted to talk about, right? Which basically says, you probably don't want to talk about Ted Cruz because it makes you unique. Sure, it makes you unique, but in order to be able to sell that news article to the extent that you want it to be able to profit, means that it requires so much work, and you would have to outcompete all the other articles out there that are really trying to take opportunity on the fact that this whole Trump situation is very scandalous. But by the way, we also think that there are many other individuals who read this, not just Republicans. We think that given the fact that there are many individuals who are on the fence with this more than before, because Donald Trump is running now, we think that it's very important that we try to sell this newspaper and try to portray Republican candidates, especially Donald Trump, that is otherwise seen as evil, to be seen someone that is approachable, that is sellable, that makes the Republican Party as a whole not be seen that evil after all. No. So why is this then necessary? First off, I'm going to do it the other way around because I think this one's more important. I think the reason why this is necessary is because it helps the way in which Republicans are perceived. Trump gets a lot of coverage, correct, even by news agencies of which you have no control over, right? But you need to acknowledge as to what sort of coverage is he getting. Rarely is the coverage ever saying that he is a saint, he is an angel. It is all of the time bashing of Trump, making people on the ground feel brainwashed and no other perception is ever given to them, right? And this is bad because the point at which people are constantly getting news about Trump and considering the fact that people are ready to start off already had no faith in the Republican Party because usually Republicans are seen as bigots. But moreover, when Trump comes in trying to sell the idea that Republicans are bigots, makes people immediately assume that Trump is bad
Republican is bad, we should never listen to what the Republicans have to say because this is just a validation of what the Republicans are. That is bad because you, as a supporter of the right-wing rhetoric, want to make the Republican perception be seen as something that is much more sellable, not just to the people who right now are wondering whether or not they should leave the Republican Party, but even those who are currently within the fence in this. We want individuals, and we want this person in particular, as the actor, to at least try to portray Trump in a much more sellable manner. And the reason why it's important is because we want individuals to have less of an inclination to immediately make that presumption that the moment you think of a Republican, because Trump is the face of the Republican, and because news coverage constantly talks about how evil he is, this means that Republican sentiments can be one that we can never opt for. This is especially important to try and capture those fence sitters who are currently moving away. We want to portray at least the Republican, even if we can't tell them in totality that like Trump is an angel, at least you try to justify it with some form of like rhetoric and analysis that would have otherwise not existed. And the reason why this is important is because a lot of the time when you're writing articles, and especially when it's supposed to be analytical, it's supposed to give you a lot of insight of which you would have otherwise not had. And we think this is important to make it much more sellable. No. What questions us? But why don't you just write about other candidates? It's not just about having interest of the people, right? But it's also because we feel that there's just simply no point when people would already be turned off to even read about any other Republican candidate out there because of the perception of which they have absorbed already from the pre-existing media coverage of saying how evil Donald Trump is. Given the fact that they are so used to the portrayal that Donald Trump is evil and Donald Trump is the front runner of the Republican Party, that this has to be what the Republican Party is for, means that even if you try to make other articles about other Republican candidates, citizens and people on the ground are less inclined to even want to read about it because they feel so turned off. So the best option then becomes, how do you make the Republican Party seem much more sellable? It's by taking the opportunity of already using the Trump rhetoric, the Trump card, then you need to portray it in a much more sellable manner. Because the moment people see a title of the article says Trump, they read it. The question then becomes how you exploit that opportunity of which people are very much interested to read about anything about Trump is by making them read an article about Trump that says he's actually not that bad after all, to change the mentality of people on what they have about Republicans. Sure.
Given that you consider Trump's bigotry and prejudice, you're basically saying newspapers need to lie about his credentials to the entire Republican population.
No. I never said that as the actor, you have to immediately say Trump is a bigot, right? I just said that the point at which you are writing an article, whether or not you support him, whether or not you think he's going to win the election, you should be able to write these articles, not an outright lie, right? If anything that's what politics have taught me, is that you can always try to just say what he actually meant. Because Donald Trump doesn't go around and say fuck Muslims, right? What did he go around and say? He said that the reason why we have less of an inclination to want to let Muslims in is because of several security measures and several other security reasons. Those are the things of which you can amplify on. And even if it's not just that, you can add on and say the reason why you would more likely to think that Donald Trump is positive is also because he said things such as he's not willing to cut a budget in terms of Social Security or Medicare benefits, right? These are a lot of the things of which Donald Trump are also doing that you can highlight. But lastly, the reason why this is important to assist the way democracy is working and to help voters become more informed is because you have more of a balance going to evaluate Trump and to evaluate the Republican Party as well. Because currently, when every news you have is one-sided, that makes for a non-informed choice of an individual. This debate isn't about acknowledging whether or not Trump should run or whether or not his policies are good, but what we can do to make individuals more informed of what their choices are, but lastly, also to allow individuals to maybe not be turned off immediately by what the Republican is. For these reasons, I'm proud to choice.
I thank the members of Council for my speech, not by the members.
Mr. Chair, the conservative media is incredibly powerful in influencing Republicans, especially its hardcore supporters. That is why, after Fox News reported the third GOP debate was is reports that Kenny Megan is reportedly talking about Trump. After Trump getting onto multiple talk shows on the GOP and on conservative media, this is when Trump sort of take the front seat of GOP. We argue on side closing opposition. That was a strategic and moral error of the media, and the media is guilty to correct that from side republicanism. Trump was not created by his own charisma, nor by a strong policy structure, nor by ideology. Trump is created by the media. The failure of the debate so far on all teams is to assume that the perspective on behavior structure of all voters and candidates are always static. We argue that it's not the case. It can be changed by media, and we will argue to you two things. One, on how the prime duty of conservative media is to scrutinize the government under the lens of conservatism and how they are handling that on side government. And secondly, on how you're destroying the narrative of republicanism. All rebuttals we integrated except all rebuttals were opening government. So what opening government and closing government extended was saying this. Oh, it's so one-sided right now. There's no exposure for Trump. There's no chance for Trump to defend himself. Ladies and gentlemen, there was so many videos about Trump giving speeches, talking about himself. He already has enough opportunities to believe Trump can speak for himself. If he cannot, we do not believe he has the duty to twist that for them. But now, let's move on to my first extension, how they will clash with closing government. Because you have to recognize, to twist positive cases for Trump, you have to make analysis. How will these analysis clash with the fundamental values of the conservative media? That includes, one, that we believe in constitutionalism that protects the rights of citizens, where Trump violated by saying we would categorically violate the rights of our citizens of Mexican origin and believe in Islam. Second, these media believe in the responsible usage of government funding, and that's why they're against Obamacare. And that is again against Trump's spending on huge sums of money to build a great wall to stop Mexicans from coming in. We also believe that we have to limit government boundaries to prevent government from becoming overpowerful. That is against the policies of Trump, where they say all these identity groups like Muslims have to register themselves with government so we can properly look over them in the neighborhood. We believe what is the conclusion of all of these, and that is when you have to make all these analysis and all these articles about Trump, and you have to consistently support the inconsistent policies of Trump. That is when you have to make all these articles that betray your own values, that betray your own perspectives. And next time, when you have to make articles slamming the Obama administration, slamming future Democrat administrations, no matter it's Hillary or whoever won the election, this is when you lose the credibility, because you're no longer able to defend your own ideologies. That's why it's extremely important in the value of conservative media, because conservative media is not just here to earn money. It is here to defend a particular ideology that government is to be scrutinized, especially by media, to prevent it from becoming overpowerful. But when media itself has to support policies that go against all these ideologies, that is when it fails its functions. And that's why closing government is idiotic. Because closing government is arguing that, oh, we have to make all these arguments, somehow analysis to succeed. We say analysis could not have succeeded unless you twist either your ideology around or policies around to the extent that people no longer believe in their ideology in order to support Trump. Like closing government also said this, no, not now. Closing government said that, oh, but people won't read otherwise, and therefore to allow people to read, we have to do that. We can understand why that is the case. Because we have to understand, why are people reading about Trump right now? We believe, apart from the most hardcore supporters, who is, by the way, not the majority of Republicans nor of Americans, most of people who read Trump is because it's funny, because it's crazy, and because they want to know why it's so crazy. And that's why negative emphasis on Trump will work just as well. When you have an article tagline saying Trump is not a Republican, when you have a tagline saying that Cruz lands on Trump, this is why we believe it will attract the same amount of attention that closing government can give you. That's why closing government is not even fulfilling the burden of side government. Because we're not here to defend emphasizing on Trump. We're here to defend positive emphasis on Trump, and that is where they fail. Now, on to the second extension. No, not now. On how it destroys the narrative of conservatism. Because we say Republicans are facing a crisis where they're losing their youth generation and they're losing sway voters. That is why before Trump, the Republican Party has been changing. That's why we see the Republican Speaker, Paul Ryan, trying to return to the policies of Reagan, but they're trying to reconcile Democrat parties, when they're trying to mediate the policies once more. But all of these are betrayed by Trump and the media. How is that the case? Because the moment Trump comes in and the media comes in, that's when the media creates an illusion by polls, by talk shows, by media coverage that Trump is the winner of the elections right now. They only focus Trump. That's where a lot of Republicans are not genuinely supporting Trump previously. But strategically, if they think that Trump is the only winner anyways, that's why they will switch to Trump. Most more importantly, when the candidates of other sectors of Republicanism also think the only way to win is to sound like Trump, that's when Ted Cruz is sounding extremely like Trump right now. That's when Jeb Bush gave up his initial conservative policies right now. That's when Bankers and Rubio got insanely crazy when they initially had different policies, when they initially had different structure. That's where structure of these narratives can be changed and could change. Initially, they were changing for the better side for Republicans. Now they are changing words because of Trump. Before I go on closing.
Sir, you just conceded that the only way Ted Cruz articles can get attention is if you link it to Trump. In what world would your viewers actually be interested in reading about Ted Cruz and not be turned off by the Republican sentiment that Trump is currently sending?
Closing government, just list up the entire context of attributes for you. The very reason why Ted Cruz has to view himself on Trump is because of the disproportional emphasis that Trump is getting. When government bench is going for not just disproportionate emphasis, mind you, but disproportionate positive emphasis, that's when Ted Cruz loses the chance of saying, I am against Trump. That's when he can get attention. But he can only say, I go along with Trump. These policies are only more sophisticated. That's when you get more Republican candidates saying that we are also along these lines, but we are only a bit more sophisticated, gain more supporters also on those lines. Radicalization is not necessary right now, especially when the media drops and slams on Trump. It will become necessary when it becomes a positive emphasis and not just emphasis when they have no choice but to do that otherwise. And that is where opposing government also fails, even in terms of profit structure. Because in the end of the day, if I'm a Republican, I'm not really going to tune on Fox News except for fun and slamming on them from time to time. The real people who watch Fox News are the conservative bases. And when these policies alienate even the moderate Republicans and the Republican elites who know about what is Republicanism, that's when you lose the conservative base. When these conservatives no longer see Fox News as a conservative media, but rather as a populist media who simply insanely support Trump, that's when they will no longer watch Fox News, because Fox News is no longer the source of conservatism anymore as well. And that is where you lose your audiences. Ladies and gentlemen, in the long term, being fun and being crazy, being stupid is not enough to attract the audience. You have to stick along with the initial role of the media platform, and that is where we proudly oppose. Thank you very much.
I expect people to speak down right comments.
As a conservative editor, you have to be strategic. You have to be strategic about what's good for the Conservative Party as a whole. And right now, there's a huge, extremely negative onset bias that currently exists. We think that extension does not at all deal with that negative bias that already exists, and instead runs an ideal world in which all other newspapers will miraculously talk about all other candidates equally. We think that was not. I have two questions under my issues, right? Number one, is there a reduction of coverage on other issues as a Republican? Our extension deals with this question really, really well. It's something that opening and closing want to talk about. And secondly, what are really your interests as a right-wing editor, and how do you then be specific? A couple of things. First of all, they gave a principled concession when they told you that the reason why Donald Trump is extremely popular is because he is scandalous. That means that under your proposal, for Ted Cruz to be just as popular, he must then also be scandalous, or else other people will not be reading him, right? Therefore, it is far less strategic for you, and it's far more dishonest for you as to make Ted Cruz into a scandalous figure. At least Donald Trump is honest about his scandalousness. But secondly, sit down. Secondly, your like idealist world only works if all the newspapers miraculously start talking about Ted Cruz and about all of these other like Republican papers. Because what's more likely to happen is that the few newspapers that do focus on Trump because he is scandalous will continue to get all the views, right? And will continue to be in wide circulation. So the best case scenario, even if all newspapers switch, is that nobody will be reading your newspapers anyway. Ultimately, you as a newspaper editor have to be strategic, something I will talk more about. Sit down. But more than that, right, and I think this is reaching to the real heart of the question, is there a reduction of coverage on other issues? All right, so it's considered that Donald Trump is only popular because people view him as a caricature, right? People think he's the spawn of Satan. Well, that's why our strategy is to make him seem less like the spawn of Satan, right? At the point where you are humanizing Trump and you're telling people that he isn't an insane caricature, he automatically becomes less interesting. People automatically do not associate him. So there's twofold benefit here, right? And I think our extension deals with. Number one, there's less interest on Trump because he's not automatically relegated to this caricature status that makes him so scandalous. So you reduce his scandalousness. This is something extremely strategic as an editor that you want to rehumanize him. Sit down. But secondly, that negative onset bias, because he's necessarily tied to the Republican Party as a whole, is much further reduced because sit down, because that means that the immediate association that comes with the Republican Party isn't Trump but other individuals. And the long-term effect of this is that you then create momentum at the point where Trump is a less scandalous of a figure. You create momentum naturally for other stories of other Republican parties to start coming up, right? To start talking about Ted Cruz at the point where people are less interested in Trump to begin with. That's why it's extremely important that you give an honest view of what Trump actually is and not a continuous caricature and feeding into the bias of what individuals currently believe him as. Before I go on to my next argument, I'll take opening.
Trump is incredibly popular right now because of the controversial things he said. But you also might want to twist his words into something boring to appeal. So what happens with popularity?
So for sure, Trump has already had a huge wave of popularity that he can continue to ride on. But we also concede that you do also want to have other Republican or other candidates. That's something that we are also fighting for. So it's a twofold thing, right? We are currently riding on the wave that Donald Trump already has and using that to our benefit, aka the Trump card. That's something that we've talked extensively about. Secondly, what is your interest as a right-wing editor? Sit down. You have to concede under that side that we think that it ultimately damages the newspaper. Because what is extremely unstrategic for you as a newspaper editor, not to grab a piece of the hot story that is like Donald Trump, right? Ignoring the story then means that other individuals or like other people who are reading your newspaper are less likely to read your newspaper, right? That means they'll read other newspaper. And that's extremely important because that means your sway as a conservative newspaper is much more harmed at the point where you are not, you don't grab a piece of the hot story. So you don't have the ability to reach out to other individuals with stories that you do want to reach out, and that's extremely bad. But the second thing is that the awareness, right? I think OG touched upon the awareness a little, but I'm going to tell you why it's mutually exclusive to why it has to be a good thing, right? Here's why you have to do it possibly. The reason is because true or not, a lot of individuals have conflated Donald Trump with the Conservative Party. And at the point where you, as an editor, concede that other individuals have conflated Donald Trump, you want to highlight these positives. Because we also have to concede that the Conservative Party and Donald Trump do not disagree upon everything, right? They're like the overarching policies that Donald Trump fight for are the same overarching policies that Conservative fight for, right? Like less government spending, for example. What you want to do as an editor is find the policies on which Donald Trump aligns with the other conservative parties and spin that into a positive light so that you make it the best for other conservative individuals. That means you can do two things, right? Number one, you can use Donald Trump as a tool to show why the Conservative Party is already a good thing, or if you're worried that Donald Trump is such an evil person and like what if people start believing the negative things, it's already a counter check and balance under status quo where enough newspapers cover all of these negatives already, right? So that means you will never have to be worried about the negatives outweighing the positives because it's already always going to be a scandalous story. So you have to use that to your benefit and not play the game. It's extremely important that you be strategic in this debate. Second, lastly, right? There's a principal concession coming from OG because their only issue with Trump, their only issue with Trump is just because he's unlikely to win. Look. Just talking statistically, right, like facts. He has been some of the highest polls. People said he would like fall out of the primary. He's still there. I'm not saying that Donald Trump will win, but if your entire case is premised upon the fact that it's unlikely to win, that means you are principally okay. If he is likely to win, then we do support Trump. We think that's a very, very difficult concession for you to make. For all of the reasons that I told you, I'm so very proud of the vote.
The speaker for his speech is now done. The last speaker is great.
A newspaper's reputation and credibility doesn't only affect its performance in this election, but also its long-standing ability to gain revenue for the long term. Exclusive extension for our partner. Three things I want to tell you today. First of all, why the Republican Party is more fucked on their side. Second of all, why newspapers are actually more able on our side to preserve its reputation and sustainable revenue. And finally, on the idea of informed choice. But first of all, let's talk about the idea of informed choice, right? Because the entire argument from this is basically a mischaracterization. So let's get this characterization clear. My partner and I want you to remember one single thing. In the current status quo, there exist media outlets, agencies, etc., that do already glorify Trump and present him as a strongman. In fact, if you look not only at the Political Insider Facebook page with 3.5 million likes on Facebook, but also many other grassroots organizations and media outlets, they already represent Trump as a very positive, strong man. We don't even need to look at these extreme examples. Even CNN, even The Hill, and even mainstream organizations recognize him as a strong person and cover him as a competent, strong figure in his regular coverage. That is why even when you look at the actual coverage by these media organizations, not all of them are overwhelmingly negative. So we think that the entire capitalization on their side doesn't really stand because there exist other channels and other means through which people can learn about the positives and benefits of Donald Trump. But what is the comparative here? We say the comparative is that so far a lot of the discourse has been stuck on an emotional level, right? You see people emotionally saying Trump is really, really bad, and people say Trump is really, really good also on an emotional and heroic level. But what we exclusively bring you from closing is when a conservative outlet with a traditional stance that is supposed to match Trump, now standing out to denounce Trump. This sort of discrepancy and incoherence between your traditional stance and your express stance here allows your discourse to be reshaped as one based on reason and not just emotionalist characterization of what Donald Trump is like or not likable as. So their characterization is not right, but even if the characterization is right? So let's talk about the idea of information. Assume that in a better scenario, you get a bit more information about the positive, good policies that Trump can bring. Not even sure what they are, but anyhow, here's what is important. We think that an informed choice is only meaningful when you have people and candidates to choose from. My partner exclusively told you why right now the media is sculpting the dimensions such that the way through which these Republican candidates compete against each other are now driven largely by the axes of Trump. But note that this is not because Trump itself is so attractive, but my partner's analysis about why media sculpts these candidates to think that in order to beat Trump, they have to win by Trumpian line. We therefore argue here is that what you ultimately do when you have a one-dimensional narrative concerning Trump or one-dimensional debate is that you cause people to restrict a lot of their choices. You cause those in the middle market of Republican Party to be no longer able to see their firms or their versions of conservatism carried through the likes of Jeb Bush, because Jeb Bush now, by the likes of Donald Trump, has fallen in his rating to only 4%. Or when we look at Marco Rubio's originally and still very sensible economic reforms to take the government out of economic policy making, notice that what he's saying on the media right now is largely in response to Donald Trump. And this is something that's fundamentally problematic, right? When you have a newspaper that rises up and denounces the Donald Trump domination here, we say you give people more choice and the ability to engage with a wider range of choices, especially now they don't need to live under the pressure that if they don't vote Donald Trump, the Republican Party will lose. So we think that by breaking this illusion, we increase the range of choices available to people, exclusive extension. Before that, closing.
So if it's true that in saying school there are multiple news already saying he's good and bad, how's that not hurting your extension that says media only covers evil stories that's right to increase his cost of also be?
No, because we think that ultimately, this is not a debate about media only covering evil stories, but media right now sculpting Donald Trump to be the winner, because even moderate agencies are characterizing him as a strong man and someone who claims to be bringing goodness to America. We think this sort of distortion of the current level playing field is what is so ultimately bad with a unidimensional characterization on your side that Donald Trump is emotively good or emotively bad. What we exclusively bring you here is a unique position as a conservative outlet where you can stand and break free of how the liberal media traditionally perceive of you and say, I renounce Donald Trump because he does not adhere with conservative values, which I think very nicely onto this second class like newspapers, right? Because we think very importantly, what both closing and opening try to talk about is that it's interesting. You get views, and that is literally the only benefit it had from the entire site. Let's break this down. My partner already told you why, in many single ways, it's not really an exclusive benefit, right? Because notice here that people want to read about Trump, not because they think, this glorifies or criticizes Trump, but because they are inherently interested in the character and ideology and personhood of Trump himself. So either way, the viewership doesn't really change, right? Because people are still going to want to learn about the good stuff or the bad stuff of Donald Trump. It's not because of his so-called normative characterization of him, in so much as his being on the news, that people will go to these news outlets. So we don't think viewership here is actually the breaking point. What is the tiebreaker? My partner's extension. We say, ladies and gentlemen, when a conservative media outlet also has a normative duty and practical duty to represent a range of views in the conservative spectrum. In the status quo, we increasingly see a bipolarization of American media, where either they disproportionately say Donald Trump is great, or they disproportionately say just Donald Trump is bad. We think what is important here is for there to be a middle ground or central ground, where the conservative media can still act as a check and balance against the state and maintain a lot of the values that are currently being shut out and what we call chilled out by Donald Trump's presence, and enable that they can still have some sort of representation. That's number one. Number two, we also say that in the long term, in the several elections that follow the current one, you don't win by the temporary viewership, right? You win by credibility and the ability to appeal to the otherwise disillusioned non-Trumpian Republican voters that are currently unable to express their views in the status quo. We therefore say that those people who believe that Rubio as opposed to Trump or Cruz as opposed to Trump actually have the legitimate policies and a way to go in America are currently in your paradigm being shut out by a lack of representation here. What we do here is that not only do we give the moderate masses an opportunity for their views to be heard, but furthermore we maintain the legitimacy and credibility of the views amongst the Republican Party such that it ensures a long-term subscriptorship. Notice on your side that there have been increasing echoes that echo the sentiments of Senator Lindsey Graham when he said that the current Republican Party is no longer the Republican Party that he was used to from Ronald Reagan. Notice that further that it is an increasingly disenfranchised group of people who do not believe in any of the current candidates, but instead believe that Reaganism and reconciliatory approach is indeed the way to go. Our extension tells you why there's a normative duty. We'll also say that there's practical benefit for the newspaper in the long term. Because notice that most of the advertisements that goes on the newspaper don't simply decide on the basis of whom you're supporting in this election, but also when not by placing an advertisement, right? The MNCs are going to have an ideal association with their image when they place an advert on your newspapers. My partner talks about the idea of credibility and reputability, and this is particularly important in terms of economic impact for the newspapers. You're not likely to get people wanting to sponsor you if you single-handedly endorse Donald Trump. You're more likely to get someone sponsoring you when you stand for more moderate strand of republicanism. That is why we're very proud to oppose.
You're streaming your discussion. Please turn on the computer. It's not streaming your discussion. Let's close it. What are you guys talking about?